So we were talking about the motor unit and motor unit recruitment. If you were picking up something, right? If you were picking up something, you didn't know how heavy it was, you would, start lifting it. And if you realized it was heavier than you thought, you'd have to apply more force. And in that case, what you're doing is something called motor unit recruitment. Right? So if you started to pick something up, maybe your purple one is firing right over here. And then you might add in the blue one and the red one as you need more force. So that's generally what recruitment means. That is, not every fiber, not every motor unit at any one given point is going to be contracting when you have some kind of muscle contraction overall, right? So we also talked about, this rotating basis where the purple, blue, and red one would kind of contract a little bit and keep an overall light tone in your muscles, right? So that they weren't completely flaccid. And that was important for things like your postural muscles, right? Where you need to keep a certain level of tension. You weren't moving things or your body, you were just keeping a certain level of tension. So you go purple, blue, red, purple, blue, red, just to fire them off a little bit. So they can be activated within a muscle. So this might be a fascicle, this might be a whole muscle, however you want to think about it, right? So, and then we ended by noting that, the book says that the weakest motor units are going to be recruited first, with progressively stronger motor units added if the task requires more force, right? So these, in this case, they're just different colors, but we'll pretend that they have different strengths, that is, and we'll see what that exactly means right there. What they mean, what we're talking about here is a couple different things, really. Just the idea that we can do these graded contractions, that is, muscles can, apply a little bit of force or a lot of force, right? And for a little bit of time or a lot of time, right? So our muscles are going to vary its contraction by, we can either increase the number of motor units, right? So we're going to start with this motor unit right here, which happens to be kind of a small one because he's got, only one plate on. Once he puts on 2 plates, right, maybe this one kicks in, and that's going to be in addition to this one. Right, so this one is going, it starts off, it's the smallest one, that's what we're going to start off with. And then the next one's going to kick in. And then as he adds more plates here, another one kicks in. And you'll notice that this is smaller, this is a little bigger, and this is the biggest one. Right? And once you kick in this one, right, you're going to create, the bigger motor units. Right? Remember, a motor unit, one motor neuron and all it controls. This might be 10, this might be 1,000. So you have different size motor units within your muscle, and you're going to recruit those smallest ones generally first. Right? Those are going to be the first ones. So a small contraction, a stimulation here is going to result in a fairly weak contraction, right? Because it's a small motor unit, there's only 10. Stimulation here might be, say, 100 or whatever, right? And that's going to be, one motor neuron contracting 100 fibers is going to be a lot stronger. And then at this point, you're doing one motor neuron and it's going to contract 1,001, right? So once you get this hit, that's a much bigger difference, right? But that's the general way this recruitment by size is going to occur right there. You're going to do the smallest ones, and then you're going to start recruiting bigger motor units, if that's the way your muscle happens to be organized. Not all muscles, some are a little different, but this is, your general big muscles that you have. And then the other part is associated with these, probably for these mixed muscle types that we'll see. There's these are also going to reflect different types. The fibers within them are going to be of different so-called types, right? And it'll generally be, as we'll see, the difference between white meat and red meat, right? The chicken breast versus the duck breast example that I gave. Right, so that is also going to be involved in this motor unit recruitment, right? And that's going to be not only the force, but how long you're going to be able to use that force, right? Duration. Right, so this is the motor unit recruitment. This brings us into this whole type thing, right? So you'll usually, in a lot of books, they'll call them type 1, type 2A, and type 2B, right? For these 3 types, 3 general types. And these type 1 fibers, muscle fibers. And really there's going to be associated neurons with these as well. We haven't learned about motor neurons, but the different nerve cells here are going to be different too. That is, when your brain tells you to give a little contraction, this one is going to be the first one to go off because it's the easiest to set off. It's the most excitable. The slightest hint will say, okay, I'll go. This one, it takes a lot of stimulation, it says, go, and then it starts contracting, right? So this is hard to stimulate. This is easy. Don't worry about that right now, but that's also associated. But those are going to be associated with these different size and types of these units, right? So you can have these early contraction part of it are going to be the small motor units that is fatigue resistant. That is, you can do this a long time, right? Like your postural muscles, they're being contracted all day. Right? And then you start to build up as you try to increase your load that you're trying to lift. Right? These ones kick in. And these are, somewhere in between this one and this one, which is your biggest motor unit, which is, for maximum loading when you're lifting as hard as you can. And we'll see that also these are going to get tired quicker. And that makes sense, right? If you're lifting something, you can't do that for very long versus, say, holding a pencil or something like that. So early contraction, fatigue resistant ones, maximum loading, they're going to be easily fatigued for these fibers. Types, right? But I'm not going to refer to these type 2, type 3B too much. We're going to call these categories slow oxidative, fast oxidative glycolytic, and fast glycolytic. Right? So mostly we can make it a little easier by looking at this one and this one, the extremes, and then just figure everything with this one is something in between them. But these are important as well. There's actually probably more of these than anyone else. And they're also the most so-called plastic. That is, they can become this or that based on training, certain amount of training you're doing. So our skeletal muscle fibers, those types, are going to contract and relax at different speeds. Right? That is how fast they contract once stimulated. And they're also going to vary in their metabolic reactions they use to generate ATP. And this is what we talked about last time, right? Oxidative versus glycolytic. Right? We talked about generating ATP, right, based on whether we had oxygen or we didn't have oxygen. And that is going to be related to how quickly they fatigue too. Because if you have a lot of oxygen, you're going to make a lot of ATP. And so you could last longer. And you're not using as much because it's a much lower energy process. So that'll be the metabolics, the metabolics of it, based on whether they use oxygen. And then there's this concept of slow and fast glycolytic fibers. So that doesn't have really anything to do with the metabolic reactions. It's something very different. It's how rapidly those myosin head hydrolyze ATP, right? Remember this whole sequence of events over here. Your myosin head was bound to the actin filaments after a contraction. ATP comes in and binds to the myosin, the ATP binding site on the myosin head. That causes a release of the myosin head from the actin. So then once ATP binds to it, the ATP binds, that causes the release. In the binding site right here is also a ATPase activity. Right, so it's going to hydrolyze it, that is split ATP into ADP and phosphate group, which is going to transfer the energy in that bond to the myosin head, right? And put it in that so-called cocked position, like ready to pivot as soon as it interacts with that. So this is where the energy part happens right here. And how fast that occurs right here, right? If this happens very slow, this whole contraction part, the time in between contractions is going to be fairly slow. If it happens very fast, this whole sequence could happen very rapidly. If this ADP hydrolyzation, and that's the difference between the fast twitch and the slow twitch. They just split that ATP much faster. Okay, so their contractile cycles are much more rapid. So here's the myogram, right? Remember that the twitch diagram where you had that increasing use of force very rapidly up here, and then a relaxation, right? So this whole thing took a little about, it contracted in about 50 milliseconds and then went back down. Over here, it was when it did contract, right? It was, the force was much less, right? That whole twitch right there. And it took a little longer to go down, right? So this whole thing was much slower, right? Everything was going in slow motion. So these would be these slow twitch fibers, right? That's what we mean by fast and slow, just how fast, basically, how rapid the turnover of or the hydrolyzation of the ATP is, right? Faster tension development in the fast twitch fibers. So I don't think this is in your slides. I don't want to make you think you got to know any of this details here, but remember I said your movements, your muscles, certain muscles needed very fine control and they need to be very fast. Your eye muscles, for instance, are all fast twitch fibers. And so when you stimulate those, they act very fast, right? There's a quick maximum tension and then that drops very quick. So it's ready for another one right away, right? So if you stimulated it right over here, you get another one over here and another one over here. Whereas if you stimulated, this one, right, you want to wait until it's on its downstream, it would be a lot longer before you'd be able to get another contraction. So this whole slow wave over here relative to this, right, is the sort of dynamics of the speed, right? And so for your eye muscles, it's very fast. For your calf muscles, your gastrocnemius and your soleus are kind of doing different things, right? Your soleus is kind of like more of a postural muscle. That's the one you use when you're standing all day more, right? That's kind of providing that overall standing force all day, whereas your gastrocnemius might be something for more like leaping, right? And that needs a greater burst of energy right there. So that has a much faster twitch. So this is long and sustained, right? Takes a little longer, right? This one over here took like 4, they all started at the same time. This one took 7-8 milliseconds. This one took 40 seconds to get to maximum contraction, whereas this one took about 90 seconds, right? So much slower dynamics, right? So those are fast twitch, slow twitch, and something in between. All right. And then the second part was, I didn't cover this, did I? Yes, I did. I can't remember. Skeletal muscle fibers vary in their metabolic reactions they use to generate and how quickly they fatigue. We talked about this last time with the anaerobic versus aerobic breakdown of glucose. Right? So glucose was added in here, and the first breakdown leaves those 2 pyruvate molecules, and these fast glycolytic fibers can make a little bit of ATP out of that very, very fast, right? A couple of them. Whereas in the presence of oxygen, over here, those slow oxidative fibers are using this aerobic respiration, which is going to take, it goes through all these cycles, it breaks it down, makes a little bit of ATP, but all you're doing is, storing the energy, transferring the bond energy from place to place until we finally go through that ATP ACE channel, right, with the hydrogen flowing through, and you make all these ATP molecules. So this takes longer, and you produce a lot of ATP, and so the muscle can stay around active longer. Because it's, all about, this is in the presence of oxygen, we're going to see this reflected in the overall sort of histology of these two, with the exception of the actual size, the larger diameter of that. The pale color, right, is going to reflect that, because the darker red color is going to be due to myoglobin, which, remember, has the pigment in it that is going to make that color red, just like hemoglobin, right? So it's going to be red because you have those myoglobin molecules in it. You also have a lot more blood vessels, like vascularization, within there as well. So both of those make it a darker color versus this, right, which is has much less myoglobin and much less blood vessels, because they're using this initial stage of breakdown, this glycolysis, this anaerobic production of ATP. And then this one also, remember, I also talked about lactic acid, right? This pyruvate becomes lactic acid. And, so you get lactic acid buildup when you're using these big, fast twitch glycolytic muscle fibers. Those are the metabolisms of these different types of fibers. And for that other one, that fast twitch oxidative glycolytic ones, right, the FOGs, right, they're going to be somewhere in between here, right? They're not quite as fast, but they can use oxygen. Right? They're a little more, and they're more powerful than the slow oxidative one. Okay, so myoglobin, blood vessels, and also there'll be a lot more mitochondria because that's where, that ATP is going to be made in the mitochondria in that oxidative phosphorylation chain. So, here's a table which kind of explains everything. And again, what you might want to look at is, the slow SO fibers versus the FG fibers. And then you figure everything you hear is, either more like one or the other, a little more like this generally, but sometimes in between. Right, so you'll see things like myoglobin. Why would you need a large amount here? Because you need oxygen. You don't really need too much here. You need a lot of mitochondria. You need capillaries, right? That's all going to be reflected in the color and the fact that they're using aerobic respiration, right? And ATP is a separate issue. The contraction velocity is related to the ATP. The fatigue resistance is going to be related both to the ATP and the ATP hydrolysis as well as the ATP production. Right? And if creatine kinase, right, you'd have the most in here because you want that ready supply of ATP. I didn't really talk about that, but that's just another thing, right? These are using that. These have like ready storage since they're not doing this 32 ATP thing. They have a lot of glycogen as well as creatine in these high-powered muscles. And then as far as recruitment goes, right, you're going to be these lowest ones, the weakest ones, so-called, going to be the first ones. These are going to be the last. So these are, this table pretty much summarizes everything with the exception of the size of the overall molecule, not reflected here. Generally, these fast glycolytic ones are much bigger. Supposedly, these would be in the middle. These would be the smallest ones. Books are a little different. I guess this book doesn't hardly say anything about them. I think this book actually says these are the largest, so who knows? Going back, right, here's the categories of the different fiber types. And then here it is in relation to, tying it in with the whole motor unit recruitment thing, putting it all together, right? They're a mixture, right? And whatever the proportion is, depends on the individual muscle and it depends on the genetics, your genetics, right? Some people are just more genetically disposed to have like marathon body versus weightlifter body. And then there was this order of recruitment. There was the twitch speed. If it was a low force, you could keep on doing these all day. And then these were for more like bursts of energy. And the one thing I do want to note is when I talked about the size of the motor units, I said that you need fine control for things like your eyes, your hands, your larynx. Right? You need fine control. And for that, you needed small motor units. That is, one motor neuron controlling very few fibers. So in that case, the whole muscle was pretty much these fast glycolytic. So you didn't really have the choice to go to these first, right? They're all fast ones. They tired out easy, but the order of recruitment, these would be all the way. So some muscles are very predominantly this or this. And those ones which were controlling the eye and hand and stuff, they were fast glycolytic, but they did have small motor units, right? But this would be the general trend in a muscle that had like the mixture of all three types. So yeah, that would be it for the fiber types, right? And then tie it into that metabolism and the speed of the twitch right there, right? Fast twitch versus slow twitch, fatigable. And then this order of recruitment.